There is no question that in the last 300 years we have been on the movement up. Let me just say here that there is something fantastic about watching a civilized man in full control of his facts making such a speech. It is greatly entertaining. It is not surprising that it is such a hit. The economist Angus Maddison says that in the 19th century, for the first time, India was able to quadruple its population. It was doubling each century before that. I think it is British rule of law that made that possible. I think rather than looking at what happened after 47, we ought to understand what happened before 1750. And I think that history will tell us quite indisputably that the 150-year period in which we had the British rule India was the best time in the 500 years that preceded it. Not so much succeeded it, but that's primarily because of the institutions that they left behind. So Mr. Tharoor is right to some extent, but I think for the most part he's wrong.
You want to just respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a rather partial view, because after all, Angus Maddison, whom he cites, is the one who pointed to the 23% of global GDP that India had. And I think Aakar forgets that one of the reasons things improved was because of advances, for example, in things like medical care, which would have come to us whether the British were ruling us or some Maharaja was ruling us.
Okay.
The truth is that many countries have made this kind of progress in the same centuries without having to go to the trouble and expense of being colonized.
Now, I know Aakar would have something to say back on that, but Professor Kaiser has a very interesting thing of someone who went to Oxford Union before you, much before you, and had an interesting sentiment. Professor Kaiser, tell us about that.
First of all, I must compliment you for your performance there. But as a student of history, I was reminded of a speech delivered by Surendranath Banerjee sometime in 1880s. He addressed Oxford Union, exactly the same place where you were.
And the same room.
But he didn't raise same questions as you did, as he raised cultural questions. Because remember, this question was quite live for large number of people, that the British had come to India to civilize us. Not only India, other Asian and African countries. And that is where Surendranath Banerjee addressed this question of the civilizational mission of the British rule. And that is where I said that it is how funny that you claim to have come here to civilize us. The fact remains, the time we had made huge accomplishments in the field of art, philosophy, literature, governance, etc. And those were the times when your ancestors were moving in jungles in tree barks. So what he was trying to refute, that we were already so civilized that we need not be civilized as the British were claiming. Remember Rudyard Kipling's poem, White Man's Burden. And still I share it with my students, that this used to be the kind of colonial political philosophy that they had come to. As far as the economic part is concerned, Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, they all been raising these questions. So I would say your speech is in continuum with a lot of such thinking, coming from scholars, political activists, like all these people. So in a way, it
Actually,
made a huge sense to me.
Ask Aakar, do you think the timing, Aakar Patel, of the fact that Shashi Tharoor's speech, as Professor Kaiser is saying, is talking about something, things we've been taught about this in history. But Aakar, are you surprised by the kind of nationalism it has evoked, that even staunch critics of Shashi Tharoor have got up and said, you're a hero? What do you think it says about us?
I think there are two aspects. One is, as I said, the quality of the speech and the man. There is a sobriety to Mr. Tharoor that comes through in that speech. And I must add on the side that his persecution by the state, I view with great distaste. The other aspect, which is the bigger aspect, is that I think we are a nation of becharas, and we like the idea of blaming everybody else for our problem. If you look back in history, I'll make two very brief points. The Surtis, I come from Surat, we begged the British to save us from the Marathas. We fell into their arms weeping. In Calcutta, the Oswal Jains, they financed and executed Plassey. They wanted the British because the rump of the Mughal Empire was so incompetent that we needed somebody to come and save us. I think all of that is forgotten when we move into the Congress era after the beginning of the 20th century. So, and on the economic side, it must be said that when the world's economy was one man plowing his land, we had a fifth of the share. That's fine. Once Boyle and Hooke and all the rest of them come in 1760s, after the Reformation, Europe changed. We remained where we were. It is not as if our wealth was taken from India and dumped in Europe somewhere. It is that Europe picked itself up and rose. It remains there today. So I think these are some things that we need to tell ourselves, which we are not very good at doing, and that sort of explains the response that Mr. Tharoor's speech got.
No, and I can see Mr. Shashi Tharoor just nodding his head, so he's in agreement as well. To some of the
Up to a point, yeah. I mean, I think Akar is quite right about some of those things. I should add, however, that a lot of wealth was taken out of India. There was systematic loot and pillage,
Yeah.
and that we should not minimize it. It really was quite colossal.
Okay, and I want some of our students to get involved. They sent in some questions. Dimple?
Yeah.
Dimple, go ahead with your question.
All right. So, sir, you didn't talk about the genocide, the silent genocide, or the ethnic cleansing. So, what's your take on that?
If by ethnic cleansing you mean massacres of groups and individuals, yeah, I mean, that happened. But sadly, that has happened throughout our history. And I'm not sure I can specifically single out the British for it. I think their policy of divide and rule certainly contributed to a lot of intercommunal violence that might not otherwise have occurred. There was a systematic attempt to make Indians far more conscious of sort of identities that were defined by the British as clashing identities.
And I think when you talk about the fact that they came here with the whole economic aspect, Professor Kaiser had a different perspective on a group of people, the Dalits. Please tell us about that.
I mean, one would say that Dalits, there's a running theme. They said that for us, British came too late and they left too early. Remember, when everybody was shouting slogans, Simon, go back, in 1927, Justice Party in Madras was more than willing to collaborate, because for them, nationalist agenda was not so proximate as emancipation of the caste people. Dalits, scheduled caste, and all these people, they all wanted to emancipate themselves from the kind of Brahminical caste structure of Indian society, and they thought British were the best ally. So, not only that, Mahatma Gandhi also happened to say that the British did not come and rule over us. We allowed them to come and rule over us, and therefore, if you look at large number of states, Akar also mentioned it. One was playing against another with the help of the British. So to that extent, yes, the British rule was bad, and we all know that it was bad. But we were also responsible for they being as bad as it happened to
Glossed
be.
over that a bit, didn't you, Mr. Tharoor?
No, I don't. In fact, I think the caste system and discrimination against Dalits was absolutely shameful, even criminal. But, for example, in parts of Kerala that were outside British rule, there were domestic reform movements to challenge all of this discrimination. Mahatma Ayyankali in Kerala, who was a Dalit leader. Sri Narayana Guru, who came from a so-called backward community that also faced discrimination.
But he's too small for the overall
No, but
sentiment?
I'm just saying, in other words, there is no intrinsic reason why in other parts of India
Okay.
similar internal reform movements could not have arisen. We are not incapable of reforming ourselves.
Yeah.
But clearly reform was needed. It happened, you're right, under the British, and certainly the British contributed by things like the abolition of sati, for example, which I think everyone here in this country should be grateful for.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, many more questions that the students have for Shashi Tharoor on his speech that went viral.